Ugh. Baxter Bradford was the biggest kid in our grade. He was also the loudest and most obnoxious, and he was definitely the baldest. Some kids said he was bald because he pulled all his hair out in a childhood tantrum. Others said it was because of some weird thing that ran in his family. Either way, it made him self-conscious and angry, and eventually just mean. But the worst thing about Baxter was that he'd had it in for me ever since first grade, when I tattled on him for sticking gum between the pages of his music book. That was really dumb of me, looking back on it. My parents called him a garden variety bully, which doesn't seem to make any sense, since I thought gardens were supposed to be pretty and nice. Bax- Baxter was wearing his favorite outfit, baggy shorts and a blue and white striped shirt that read, Barnaby Bradford's Bestest Babysitters on the back. Yup, Baxter's father owned the company that sent us Mrs. Craig, so even his dad had it in for me. Keep walking, I said to Irvin. Not so fast, he said, pointing. Look. I looked. There she was, Daisy Flowers. Profile. Name, Daisy Flowers. I know I already profiled her, but it's nice to have an excuse to talk about her again. I apologize for this short delay. Oh no, Daisy was playing kickball with Baxter Bradford. Double ugh. I felt incredibly jealous that I didn't even have the nerve to talk to Daisy, but somehow Baxter had gotten her to play kickball with him and his friends. I don't care, I said. I'm still not stopping. Irwin started jumping up and down. Come on, this is our chance. You can tell her about your dog that might have special powers. I didn't know what to do. I definitely didn't want to deal with Baxter, but I didn't want Irwin to know I was scared of him either. And maybe I could tell Daisy about Abby. I had a feeling she was a dog person. I was trying to make up my mind when Baxter made it up for me. Well, looky here, he crowed, noticing us. If it isn't Swimmy Jimmy. Baxter had called me Swimmy Jimmy ever since I failed my safety test at the Y 3 years earlier. It wasn't even swimming, it was treading water. I hated that nickname. At that point, we had no choice but to walk over. A bunch of other kids were there, too. They all waved when they saw us coming. We waved back. Hey, Swimmy, Baxter said. What are you doing outside? Shouldn't you be in your dork cave reading your 50,000th vampire book? Then he guffawed at his own unfunny joke. Abby growled. Baxter looked down at her and laughed. That's one ugly dog you got there, by the way, he sneered. I think he's cute, said Daisy, which clinched it. She was truly, actually perfect. He's a she, I said dumbly. Who cares, Baxter muttered. Then he turned his attention back to the game. He was pitching, of course, but instead of rolling the ball like a regular person, he was bouncing it in, which made it almost impossible to kick. Strike 3, Baxter screamed as some poor kid swung his leg and missed. Maybe you should let somebody else pitch, Daisy suggested. Baxter glared at her. Mind your own business. Then, glancing over at Irwin, he said, Get out here. We need a right fielder. Irwin looked both horrified and flattered, since he'd never been asked to join a game in his life. Me? Baxter nodded with a look of disgust. Do you see another dweebazoid here? Yeah, you. Irwin ran out there as if right field were the best position in the world, as opposed to the worst position in the world, which it actually was. I closed my eyes and said a short prayer, then walked up to Daisy. You really think my dog is cute? I asked. I totally do, Daisy said, kneeling down to pet Abby. Then she looked up at me and frowned. Oh my gosh, what happened to your face? Uh-oh, my blotch. For a minute there, I'd forgotten all about it. My heart started pounding. I gotta go, I said, grabbing Abby's leash and turning to run back to my house. I took about 3 steps before a big meaty paw stopped me. Where are you going? Baxter growled. I looked up at him. It was a pretty long ways up, since he was about 5 inches taller than me. Just home. Baxter stared down at me. You leave when I say you can leave. Then he grinned. Besides, you're not going anywhere until you tell us what that thing on your face is. He turned around to the rest of the kids. Hey guys, come see what happened to Swimmy. It's awesome. Fact. Bully plus blotch equals bad combination. Everyone came over to take a look, It seemed like none of them really wanted to be mean about it, but as soon as Baxter started laughing, they all laughed too. That's how these things work. If a bully starts making fun of some kid, you make fun of them too. Because if you don't, chances are you might be next. The only two kids who weren't laughing were Irwin and Daisy. Stop it, I begged Baxter. Baxter shrugged. Stop what? All I'm doing is trying to look at your face without gagging. He turned to Daisy. Take a look. Daisy stood there frozen for a second. I have to go, she said. Then she turned around and ran down the street toward her house. Since she was pretty new in town, she probably didn't want to get involved. I can't say I blamed her. Irwin went running after Daisy. Where are you going? He called to her. Don't go. But she never looked back, and after a minute he turned around and came back. Aww, Baxter snickered. Isn't this just so sweet and precious? Wonk is in love with Daisy Flowers. I am not, Irwin insisted as all the kids shifted their attention from my face to Irwin's lack of love life. I suddenly felt incredibly relieved that no one was looking at me in my blotch anymore, which explains why I said what I said next. You are kind of in love with her, Irwin, I blurted out. It's totally obvious. Irwin's mouth dropped open, and he stared at me with a hurt look in his eyes. I immediately felt as guilty as I'd ever felt in my life. I didn't mean it like that, I mumbled, but it was too late. Forget you guys, Irwin yelled, and he took off down the street before anyone could see him start to cry. Later, Wonkmeister, Baxter crowed. Then he looked back at me, and I was sure he was going to torture me some more, but for some reason he decided not to. Let's play ball, he announced. Then he looked at me. Scarface, you in? Scarface? Suddenly Swimmy didn't seem so bad. I tried to stare at him without fear. Why not? Baxter said, walking toward me. Your little nerd buddy just left, and now we need a right fielder. I just don't feel like it. Baxter kept coming. Well, what if I don't care what you feel like? I wasn't sure what to do. Baxter was practically 2 inches from my face. I was about to make a run for it when I heard something below me. A growl. I looked down, and there was Abby, looking at Baxter like he was an oversized groundhog. She growled again, louder. Tell your mutt to be quiet, Baxter said, practically growling himself. I can't really tell her what to do, I muttered apologetically. Baxter took another step toward me, and Abby suddenly let out the fiercest bark I ever heard and bared her teeth. Out came the fangs. Baxter ran about 12 steps backward in less than a second. That dog's crazy, he yelped. I guess that's one word for it, I said. Baxter was breathing hard. I don't think I'd ever seen him scared before. Well, it figures you'd need your little doggie to protect you, he said. You better get out of here before I use her for kicking practice. Abby was still growling softly. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell Baxter I could protect myself, but for some reason I just took off down the street. Instead of going home, I ran to Irwin's house so I could apologize. I rang the doorbell for 10 minutes. He never answered. 11:38 a.m. to 6:32 p.m. Here's how the rest of the day went. I stared at my blotch in the mirror. I thought about Daisy. I felt bad about Irwin. I tried to scrub my blotch off with soap, but it didn't work. I tried to scrub my blotch off with a toothbrush, which made it worse. I thought about Daisy. I tried to call Irwin. I answered the door to let Mrs. Craig in. Wished my dad luck when he left for his job interview. I took Daisy outside, and she immediately ran under the house again. When I asked my sister to help me get her out, she rolled her eyes at me and said, I have to pick out my clothes for tomorrow. I stared at my blotch some more. I read 50 pages of Fang Goodness. I watched 2 episodes of Stop, Police. I smelled a new gross smell coming from the kitchen. Oh, and I thought about Daisy. 6:33 p.m. Dinner! I was still outside trying to get Abby out from under the house when Mrs. Craig screamed. Her voice sounded like a baboon beating up a violin. I'd already decided there was no way I was going anywhere near that kitchen. No way, no how. Until Mrs. Craig marched outside and folded her arms. Fact. When an old lady babysitter folds her arms, you have to do what she says. Do you want to know what's for dinner? I asked. Oh, do I want to know what's for dinner? I asked. Mrs. Craig laughed. It's good for you. That's all you need to know. Suddenly, I heard a noise and looked down. Abby! She'd finally come out from under the house to see what was going on. Either that or because the sun was finally behind the trees. Mrs. Craig wrinkled her nose. I want that dog outside while you have dinner. No, I said, surprising myself. She's my dog, and I want her with me. Mrs. Craig looked like she was about to argue, but then Abby let out a low growl, so instead she just turned and walked inside. When I got to the kitchen, my nostrils actually, literally, shriveled up and died. Okay, not actually, literally, but the dinner stink was even more powerful than the breakfast stink. I'm glad I can't tell you what it smelled like, because that would mean I'd smelled something like it before. And luckily, I hadn't. But there's a first time for everything, I guess. Misty stuck her head in. I'm not staying for dinner, but thanks anyway, she announced. Wait a second. Did you clear this with your parents? Asked Mrs. Craig. But Misty just waved and walked away. I stared jealously at my 14-year-old sister. Wow, I thought. What a difference 3 years makes. Mrs. Craig put a plate down in front of me. I looked at the contents. Some sort of mushy red blob smothered in green gloop. I blinked at Mrs. Craig. Are you serious? Very, she said. Her slightly evil smile reminded me of Johnny Casper, the vampire hunter in the Jonah Forrester books. Johnny would sing and whistle every time he tried to kill Jonah. He acted like he was being all nice and helping mankind and stuff, but secretly he was evil. I hated Johnny Casper. I'd rather not, I moaned. I'll just go straight to dessert if that's all right. Would it be all right with your parents if you just ate sugar for the rest of your life? Asked Mrs. Craig. Would it be all right with your parents if all your teeth fell out? Was she actually talking to me about teeth? I was about to argue when I saw her own yellow chompers shining down on me. I shut my mouth and sat at the table. Fact. Looking at someone's yellow teeth does not increase your appetite. What is this stuff anyway? I asked, even though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. Fried beets in pea sauce, answered Mrs. Craig. Eat it and you'll live to be 100 years old. I didn't want to be 100 if I have to eat this stuff. I don't even want to live until tomorrow if I have to eat this stuff. Mrs. Craig laughed, but not in an I think you're funny way. I felt the brush against my leg. I looked down and saw Abby peering up at me. She was trying to tell me something, but I wasn't sure what. Then I saw her eyes moving back and forth from me to my plate. That was it. She was willing to eat this gross food for me. What an amazing dog. I waited until Mrs. Craig started washing a pot in the sink. Then I quickly shoveled the food down to Abby. She scarfed every bite in about 3 seconds. Unbelievably, she seemed to like it. This was going to work out great. I was saved. Until I wasn't. The first thing that happened was I heard a gross noise. It sounded kind of like florpsh. Fact, when you hear the noise florpsh, you know it's not good. Yep, you guessed it. Abby vomited up pretty much everything I'd just given her. I guess fried beets aren't the best thing for a dog's diet after all. Mrs. Craig whipped her head around. What was that? Then her eyes darted to the floor where Abby was standing right next to a reddish-greenish, globbish-gloopish pile of gross. Abby started wagging her tail. Believe it or not, I think she wanted more. Believe it or not, I think she wanted more. She wasn't going to get it, especially since she jumped up on the counter and threw up a tiny bit more, and got some on Mrs. Craig's beloved, perfectly combed red hair. She screamed, "My hair!" and then made a sickening noise that sounded like a reek. Fact, a reek is even worse than florpsh. Mrs. Craig hooked my arm with her cane and screamed, "What did you do? Did you give that dog your dinner? Did you?" "That's it," Mrs. Craig howled. "I've had it with you and this dog. You both need to learn a lesson." Then she grabbed Abby by the collar. I couldn't tell which one of them was barking and growling louder. I ran after them as they rounded the corner and headed straight for the hall closet. "Wait!" I shouted, but I was too late. Mrs. Craig opened the closet and threw Abby in. Then she slammed the door shut. "It's nice and dark in there, just the way you like it," she yelled through the door. "She likes my closet, not the hall closet," I said, with tears in my eyes. "Well, I'm a babysitter, not a dog-sitter," she muttered. "She stays in there until your parents come home." Then she clomped away, her cane hitting the floor with an angry smack. Soon she was going to be a no-sitter if I had anything to say about it. 7:12 p.m. I sat next to the closet, thinking, trying to figure out what to do next. But it was hard to concentrate because of all the noise going on in the kitchen. Pots were rattling, water was running, and Mrs. Craig was singing. That's right, my babysitter was having a great time, singing at the top of her lungs, while my dog was stuck in a closet that might as well have been a dungeon. It would have been so easy to just let Abby out, but if she ran into the kitchen and did something else to make Mrs. Craig upset, then who knows what would happen. "Are you okay, Abby?" I whispered through the door. "Hang in there. I'll figure something out." No response. "Yum, yum, yum," I heard Mrs. Craig exclaim. I guess she was about to sit down to her own plate of fried blah. "I'm going to talk to her right now," I whispered to Abby, even though I wasn't moving. "Come on," I said to myself. "Be brave." I heard a slight scratch on the door, and Abby was giving me courage. After a few deep breaths, I walked into the kitchen. Guess what I saw? Mrs. Craig was sitting down to dinner all right, but there wasn't a fried beet in sight. Instead, I was staring at a cheeseburger, French fries, and chocolate milk. Fact, adults never actually eat the disgusting stuff they feed you. She looked at me impatiently. "What is it?" "You need to let Abby out of the closet," I said. "I promise she'll be good." "That dog doesn't know how to be good," said Mrs. Craig, spraying French fry particles out of her mouth. "The answer is no."